So we continue the in-between, the journey in the in-between world. This afternoon, Sheba Chhachhi is works, as she says, in the in-between world of photographs and other visual art forms, where she uses photographs to in installations, painting, etc., and which she'll explain now. She's based in Delhi, and she had studied at Delhi University and at NID. I hand over to Sheba.
Thank you, Mahesh, and thank you, Dinesh and Prashant and the whole team of Delhi Photo Festival to invite me to speak here today. It's wonderful to be part of the festival this year. I wasn't here last year. And it's good to be part of a community that I am a kind of illegitimate member of. Photographers tend to think of me as an artist. Artists think of me as the photographer who snuck into the art world. I do, in fact, have a hybrid, in-between kind of practice, something that works with the photographic image, which lies at the heart of my work, but moves from the most standard, conventional use of the photographic image, that of the document, the record, the evidential or the indexical, to multiple other ways of extending the vocabulary of the photographic image. What I'm going to do today is share with you some of these experiments and attempts to move the image itself and to move my own understanding of the image. The movements have always been impelled by questions. They are not formal experiments for the sake of form alone. So I start with where I began my photographic practice, which was as a documentary photographer, very active in the women's movement in Delhi. This is 1980. And I spent about 10 to 15 years building up a photographic archive of the women's movement. This image takes on a particular resonance today after December 13, where we have witnessed yet again, 20 years on, the general outspilling of public outrage on violence against women. This is Satyarani, whose daughter was murdered for dowry and who spent 30 long years fighting for justice to try and bring the culprits to book. I'm not showing you, this is a very large body of image, it's about 10 to 15 years of work, but by the end, it begins in the 80s, it goes up to the early 90s, and sometime around the end of the 80s and the 90s, I began to question my own practice. What I was doing at that time was to try and offer an alternative to the mainstream images of women, either as bejeweled, beautiful creatures or helpless, poor, suffering victims. These were images of strength, of protest, of women struggling to change their conditions, resisting the oppression that they faced. However, in 10 years of developing these images, both as a history for ourselves, I was not a photojournalist, so these images were not to be published in newspapers or for that kind of public dissemination, but they were really for ourselves, and their circulation was primarily within the women's movement and other similar social movements. At the end of this period, I remember one day where I went to a demonstration a little early, as usual, and found a large group of press photographers who were directing the women to take on the classic pose of the raised hand and the shouting mouth. It was a very interesting moment because the image, which was an alternative, subversive, radical image, which I had generated in my own practice over 10 years, had become, again, a stereotype. It sought to counter conventional stereotypes, but it ended up becoming a new kind of stereotype. So was this now an image which actually reflected the women that I knew, because I was a participant in the movement. I wasn't photographing from the outside. I would be pointing the camera one moment and shouting slogans the next. These thoughts, concerns also about the sort of false objectivity of the documentary image, which was the kind of lie told by the mainstream media, which presents you images as though they are the truth, while we very well know that they are not. They are subjective, constructed, created, manipulated, even though they seem to represent reality. also questions about the relationships of power inherent in the photographic relationship between the subject and the photographer, between the viewer and the image. I then went into an experiment with 7 women, fellow travelers in the women's movement, fellow feminists, and invited them to collaborate with me to create a set of what I called staged or constructed portraits. Each woman was invited to choose a site, objects, a gaze, a posture that she felt would tell her story. So I moved from working with the photograph as document to, in a sense, the photograph as fiction, as subjective narration. So this is Satyarani in 91, 10 years later from the image you last saw, firmly sitting on the steps of the Supreme Court. The files that are arranged on the steps are 70 cases of dowry victims that she was also helping, because in the process of fighting for her own daughter, she became a kind of barefoot lawyer, a part of an organization that assisted women in distress. Woven through the files is her daughter's wedding sari and the graduation photo. So these portraits, which I call feminist portraits, the series is called 7 Lives and a Dream, represented a major shift away in terms of photographic practice. These were collaborative images made together with the women. A dialogue, an intersubjective space produced by what happened between us. So the image was neither created by me nor by the woman, but by what came up between us. We would often take photographs, look at small prints, contact sheets were difficult mostly, redo, rework. It was a sort of theater of the self, and the invitation was to perform your own story. This has strong resonances, of course, with the Bazaar Studio vernacular tradition, which we're all quite familiar with, and I think there's been some discussion in the festival already around that. So this practice is somewhere between the documentary and the Bazaar Studio, and I think perhaps in the early 90s was the first example of using the staged or constructed portrait to narrativize and to shift away from this false idea of the photograph being a representation of the real, but in fact making the fictional explicit. So here you see Shah Jahan Appa. The setup that we created, these were like mise en scènes, almost like theatrical frames within which each woman would perform her story. It's very interesting how almost everybody included a previous photograph in their mise en scène. So you have here documentary photographs taken over the years, which are part of her setup. The burqa, a little house made out of a shoebox, because she said, "Meri kahani jhuggi jhompdi ki kahani hai." Urvashi Butalia, who some of you may be familiar with. Her fantasy was to set up her large collection of typewriters on the street, but we just weren't able to achieve it. So this is within her own home, with several other elements brought in together to present a sense of who she was. What I'm showing you is not in strict chronological order, but in fact loops back and forth across time, because my own practice is quite recursive. Last year, curiously enough, in September, almost exactly a year ago, I was provoked by a curator to go back to my archive of the 15 years from the 80s to the 90s of the women's movement. And in going back to it, I created a new work, an installation called Record Resist, which in fact is currently showing at the Kiran Nadar Museum in Noida, if any of you can trek out there to see it. It's part of a show with other interesting works as well. So here the archive is annotated by a video projected on the floor, in which I look back at being a photographer who was a feminist and an activist, along with being a photographer, and try and examine the slippages both in terms of collective action and in terms of photography itself. I don't think there's going to be, I had wanted to show a clip from the video, but since we're quite tight of time, I think I won't go there. Maybe later at the end or something. Essentially, it starts off with photographing post-mortem corpse we'd sneaked into All India Medical Institute, into the morgue, somehow managed to get in there, trying to create evidence for a case of the killing of a beautiful young woman. And I was then hounded by her mother, who wanted to see those images, and I felt that she should not see them, that these should not be shown to her. And I did not show them. Years later, they mysteriously vanished, and that is where the video begins and then goes into unpicking this complex relationship between being the documentarian, being a participant, an activist, and trying to work with what I think of and what I describe as intersubjectivity, a kind of special space, a special form of empathetic relationship between the subjects and the viewers, as well as the photographer and the subject. So here, what happens is that you can actually, this space is quite deep. It's about almost 20 feet or 24 feet deep. And you move between these photographs, which are suspended quite precariously in space, encountering each individually as well as seeing them as a whole image. The gaze continuously moves from the video on the floor upwards to the photographs. These photographs are selected from the archive and include as well some of the staged portraits. These are just a few stills from the video. Record Resist became curiously important, even though it was made in September, because of what happened in Delhi. And it was a measure of several things. One was the huge difference in the way representation of photography happens today. December 13th was highly photographed, with this fantastic democratization of the power of image making with mobile phones, with everybody being able to produce an image. They were images continuously uploaded, and you could even say that the images fed into the struggle and into the protest and played an important part in the circulation and the build-up of information and gathering support around the issue. While in the 80s, I was probably the only, or there may have been a few other people who was actually recording this. And because of working in film, because of working with analog processes, the delay between actually seeing these images and the activity that was going on also marks a huge significant change in what we understand as photography and as evidential photography today. For me, the movement is away from the document as we have classically understood it to something that is perhaps more of an event. The photograph today is something transient, produced at high speed, consumed at high speed, and often lost at high speed. So there's a very different character, both in terms of the temporality of the political struggle, the history of the women's movement, and photography as part of that. These are further stills from the video, and if we have time at the end, I'll go back to the video. It's quite long, so I don't want to spend a lot of time with it now. One of the things that troubled me at the time that I made the constructed portraits was the way people looked at photographs on the walls. There was something that I thought of as the gallery walk, where people walk in, they go swiftly past the images, almost as though they're flipping through pages of a magazine, and they feel they have got whatever the photograph needs to say, because the focus is on information rather than on contemplation. So I was very interested in trying to create a kind of delay, a lag, a kind of deference, which could perhaps induce a space of contemplation. This is what led me to move the photograph off the wall into space and into photo installation. This, of course, is a very recent work. It's from last year, working with very old images. Okay. I thought I was going somewhere else, but I'm somewhere else, so we'll go here. So one of the ways in which I started working with the photographic image was, in fact, as image as object. This was a site-specific installation in Modi Nagar, which was basically in a state of crisis because of closed down factories, rampant unemployment, and the re-employment of skilled factory workers as casual labor. So this work is in the feudal home of the erstwhile mill owners, factory owners, where the separation between what's happening outside and what's happening inside is collapsed by bringing these images in. I interviewed and photographed a number of workers who had been displaced and brought their images into this place. Over the classic fireplace was an engraved mirror over which I layered transparent portraits of the workers. You can see it better here. And projected on that was an image from the abandoned factory, debris from the abandoned factory, and a machine on the fireplace. On the classic black and white tile, which used to be the sign of wealth and is today reproduced in most hotel lobbies, I introduced a photographic tile, a wooden block, which was a close-up image of the hands of Itbari Khan. The installation is called Itbari Khan Ke Haath, holding his factory card, his factory ID. This tile then actually traveled 10 years later. It reappeared in a new form in the Bhaudaji Lad Museum, which is the ex-V&A of Bombay, where that same kind of checkered tiled floor lay at the feet of Prince Albert in the grand entrance hall of the museum. I was invited by the museum to make an intervention from my existing work, which would respond to what I found in that situation. The museum is in Baikula, an area which has been characterized by factory shutdowns, and it seemed absolutely perfect to the audiences that come in are actually a large number of ordinary people because it's next to the zoo. People go to the zoo and stop by the museum. So it's actually really crowded and cross-class, and large number of working class and middle class people come to the museum. So these tiles were inserted, and as you walk down, this is a really long stretch, so it's almost like a long pavement of tiles with Itbari Khan's hands. And as you come up to the plinth, where in gold is engraved a declaration about art and science and civilization, you encounter once again the translucent portraits of the workers as a punctuation to the power of Prince Albert, which is continued in different forms by the state authorities today. So moving from the photograph as document, bringing it into space, turning the photograph into an object, but parallelly continuing to work in the more straight photography way. So I'm going to show you excerpts from another substantial body of work. I tend to do very long series. This is work that stretched over 10, 11 years, where I grew very interested in women ascetics, women sadhus, who to me represented a kind of indigenous feminism as they step out of roles within family and society. They're not wives, they're not mothers, they're not daughters. They reinvent themselves in relation to the metaphysical. This set of images documents their initiation process, where each woman is stripped naked, her head is shaved, her name is removed, all the markers of femininity are removed, and she performs death rites to her ordinary social self, going back 7 generations, and is reborn as a sadhu, and usually reborn from the river and named after the river. So the series that follows from this is called Ganga's Daughters. These are women who have chosen to step out of conventional female roles. They are within another kind of structure, which has got its own patriarchal character, but within that they have found a space. This is a space that has actually been explored by women in South Asia from the 4th century onwards, and we have very powerful poetry and images of women coming down from that period to the present day. There are very large numbers of these women who exist. They have many freedoms which we would consider to be the freedoms of a modern woman. They have mobility, they have a performative identity. They are not bound by the social relations that they were born into. They are bound only by the community that they have chosen to be part of, and that is for a very limited purpose. They form bonds, sororities, solidarities amongst themselves, which are based on kinship and affinity rather than blood, or social relations which have been predetermined by village or gotra or caste or community. So there's a radical reinvention of self that happens with these women, which became extremely interesting when I developed a series of portraits. One of the reasons these women interested me was because gender was performed. Many of them take on an almost androgynous aspect. The markers of femininity are stripped away and they become some kind of creature who, in the words of Akka Mahadevi, hovers between being man and woman, neither one or the other, and neither a third sex. This is truly a reinvention of gender and of self. And it is performative. A lot of new work in the art world and in cultural theory looks at performativity as something produced by contemporary social situations and as a form of resistance and critique as well as play. Here we find a traditional space that has long been used in this manner and involves, in fact, a considerable amount of play. Shantigiri, Jyotirma, Bhadramahila. Some of the names are generic because very often the women take on generic names. So they may be named after a river, or they may be called Kepi or Mataji or Pagli. These are no longer individual identities, but in fact generic identities. Gangagiri, Pagli, Mirapuri, Bairagan, Buri. I show these works as a set of 12 portraits, which I call the Rogues Gallery, and one of the frames suddenly begins to move. No, it doesn't. So maybe we'll just watch this like this. There's a problem with the videos playing easily. These are found images of Yogini Amman, a woman ascetic from the south, that were given to me. She's from somewhere around the late 1950s. And it is all the same woman, and it's very interesting to watch how she plays with masculinity, femininity, and another kind of transcendence. We move from her to Mirapuri, Shri 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 Mahant Mirapuri. I'm afraid the playback is not as smooth as it should be. I'm just taking you back for a moment to this image of the installation. What I'm doing here is really working with the fairly substantial number of photographs I had around, say, Mirapuri, who I followed for about 10 years, to try and create a sense of the political dangers involved in a woman emerging into power, her taking on of certain male authoritarian characteristics, and the performance and the play involved in that. So I'm moving away from the tension between the still and the moving. It's not video. I very deliberately choose not to use video to do this, but to actually animate a series of stills. And I think there's something very special that happens when you are looking at a series of very large still portraits, and then you encounter this movement, which is a movement that is somewhere between the still image and the moving image. This is something that I return to, this interest in animated stills, in working with the still as a moving image rather than moving image as in video or film. So I'm taking you back to the first experiment of taking the photograph into space, combining it with sculpture, developing it as an object. This is a work which worked with some of the history I referred to of the long tradition of women ascetics and the very powerful poetry that we have. These are terracotta sculptures that are laid out on a kind of archaeological site covered with broken fragments, where I use reproductions of such images, representations of such women's through history, from Chola bronzes to calendar images to miniature paintings, and you walk through this kind of cracked archaeological site, encountering these images before you actually encounter. There are only 2 photographs within the sculptures. You encounter Jyotirma and Buri. That work is called Wild Mothers 1, and it continued in another series called Wild Mothers 2, where I actually sought to bring together images of women who were transforming themselves from within, as following a spiritual path and moving out of ordinary social life, as well as women who were struggling to change the social world and themselves in that way. So creating a palimpsest, which was layering women ascetics with women in protest. It's a very large installation. In the center is a huge mound of coal on which rests a terracotta sculpture, and the images are suspended in space. This is 94, and they are actually film positives, because at that point it was the only way you could actually achieve a transparent image. It was, a lot of these experiments are so much easier and seem, like, why do it that way? Because it's so simple now to print on a clear material. But at that point there was no possibility. So it was also a lot of technical experimenting, trying things out, simply to try and make certain things happen. So what happens when you come in here as a viewer is that you actually encounter images through each other. And if you change your position, you will encounter another set of images. There were about 21 photographs in this, but you could create really different narratives and different weights and different valences as to which image you saw first and which you saw through which. In addition, on the ground was a reflecting surface where you saw yourself. So the viewer herself or himself was implicated in these narratives. One of the reasons for these experiments has been a really deep concern with the relationship with the viewer, and to try and shift people out of a kind of habit-ridden encounter with the photographic image. So to refresh that encounter, to make something else happen. These are very early experiments, and in a way you've now seen 3 works which draw on the same archive of material, but actually do very different things with it. And that is, I've chosen to do it this way, to actually share these processes of what it means to extend the vocabulary of the photographic image. What other possibilities can one produce in combination with space, light, other materials, etc.? Another interest has been looking at the female body, which is one of the most favorite photographic subjects. And this was an attempt to actually work to create images which were not voyeuristic and which would somehow separate themselves, celebrate often what is considered ugly or unattractive according to conventional notions of beauty. So I have a very small excerpt from this body of work. It's called Notes to the Body because the addressee is the body. This extends into a work on the sensuality of the aging body. The aging woman is often considered to be out of what could be considered part of sexuality, sensuality. This is a work called Silver Sap, which explores that as well as notions of identity. So they're normally shown together, but I'm showing you these separately just for you to get a feeling of the images. This is how it works. So the laboring body, which is again not considered a sensual body, the aging body, these are attempts to recuperate and in a way offer a critique of conventional images of the female body. This is another ongoing work, and I'm always looking for willing subjects. That's a hint. So again, this work, then some of these images find their way into an installation called Rakta Pushp, which is a work on looking at discourse around the female body through the prism of menstruation. It basically maps three major discourses where menstruation is considered as polluting, dirty: the Brahmanical discourse, the agrarian magical discourse where menstruation can be considered fertility enhancing and is celebrated, and the medical management discourse, which is simply how can you not see it, not smell it, not have to deal with it. So these three discourses are like texts. These are bodies which are texts, and a huge amount of research has gone into these columns. Objects float inside the volume of the thing, and these texts actually represent the overlapping, sometimes contradictory but continuous play of these discourses in the way we understand women's bodies within India. What is repeated are different names for menstruation which actually embody and make explicit these three different attitudes. So if you've probably noticed that Buri seems to pop up in all the works, and it's almost like she decided that she was the mediator. A lot of in moving out of the documentary mode, I got more and more interested in research and looking at the pre-modern world, whether it is in terms of the women ascetics or pre-modern writing, or various ways of looking at body, self, nature, spirit from pre-modern philosophies. So Buri acted as a mediator for many years for that. I take you now to a very different register. Here the photograph is accompanied in a very conventional way by text, by testimony, but they are not on the wall. This is a work called When the Gun is Raised, Dialogue Stops, Women's Voices from Kashmir. And testimonies were gathered over a period of 6 years, speaking to a very wide range of Kashmiri women in the valley, ranging from housewives to weavers to daily wage laborers to doctors to teachers, a really wide range of women who also had a wide range of relationships to the conflict and to the undeclared war. So they were women whose brothers or husbands were militants. They were women who had been raped by the army. They were women who had been sexually abused by the militants, etc. The main idea was to actually move out of the narrowly polarized debate on Kashmir, which seems to think of it as having only two sides. That's Hindu-Muslim, India-Pakistan, patriot versus terrorist, etc. Muslim itself is a category that is completely opened up. There is no one homogeneous Muslim. There's Shia, there's Sunni, there's Gujar, there's Bakarwal. There's a wide range of different kinds of Islam within Kashmir, with a strong Sufi tradition, which tends to be left out of any discussion. So these, what we did was to create, in fact, something that looks like it has two sides. But as soon as you start to read and look, this false binary completely dissolves, and you move around the entire installation, realizing that these are false polarizations. Another thing that happens, because you have to actually make an effort, you have to bend down to read the testimonies. When we first set this up, this work is made in collaboration with Sonia Jabbar, who's a writer and filmmaker who's worked extensively on Kashmir. We weren't sure that people would actually read all 32. There are 32 of these brick plinths, would read all 32. But what was extraordinary was that, having made the effort to bend down and to hear these women's voices and their images speaking directly to you, people would almost form like a procession and read each one of them. I'm absolutely sure that the same material on the wall would have had a very different response. And this is part of what I'm trying to, open up for discussion here today, is really how can we extend the encounter with the photograph? How can we create space for contemplation? How can we enrich this so that we don't dismiss it as yet another photograph? We're in a kind of moment where I don't think there've ever been so many millions of images in circulation as they are at this very moment. So there's something happening to our receptivity to images. And as photographers and as image makers, we really need to consider different ways of trying to enter that arena, to try and think about the relationship with the reception of the photograph, with the viewer, as much as we think about the creation of the image. I haven't included any testimonies because that, again, becomes too dense. So I'll just give you a sense of some of the photographs. This work was, these photographs are all taken in 1994, which was the height of the militancy, when it wasn't very easy to go to Kashmir and to photograph. The very first showing of this installation was in the Habitat Center in the Visual Arts Gallery, and it was really interesting because we could not get a place to show this. Nobody was willing to touch Kashmir. It was too hot. There was a lot of right-wing Hindu goons coming in and breaking up exhibitions. I'm talking about 2000. And so we had connected with a seminar on women in conflict, which was being held under the aegis of an NGO. And the day before the opening, they came to us and asked us if we would allow the MEA to vet the installation, and we refused and said we would take responsibility for whatever happened. We weren't allowing anybody to censor this. So the next day, when it opened, it actually got an extraordinary response. Our desire was to humanize the discourse on Kashmir, and people really responded. You were listening to women who had the same concerns as any ordinary person has, and who are trying to maintain life, grace, and dignity in extremely difficult situations. So by evening, there were very large numbers of people. There was a lot of coverage, and the organizers who had removed their board quietly brought it back. Unfortunately, the work still remains valid because the situation has changed, but not to an extent which actually renders these statements or these images irrelevant. I would be very happy if it was something that one could say is dated, but even 13 years after its first presentation as an installation, it could be put up today and be absolutely contemporary to what's happening. It's just back to another view of this. Each is made out of very humble materials, bricks, rice, and the wooden rihal. The rihal is used as to hold every holy book, whether it's the Bible, the Quran, the Guru Granth Sahib, or the Gita. So we use it quite deliberately, a little subversively, to insert these iron sheets which carry the images and the texts as a kind of different text produced through 22 years of undeclared war. I'm taking you now to a work that doesn't have an easily recognizable or apparent photographic component, and yet it is for me a photographic work. This is a large installation called Neelkant, Poison Nectar. I mentioned earlier that I got more and more interested in pre-modern thought, and one of the reasons that this developed into an inquiry into the philosophic origins of how we looked at our environment and the relationship between human beings and the environment was my deep despair and horror at what was happening around us. The absolutely insane hyper-urbanization, the pollution of every basic element, the poisoning of everything, whether it is earth, water, air, fire, or words themselves. So we start with images taken in the big landfills, the dumps, the biggest garbage dumps of Delhi, Ghazipur, where these are treated in a kind of British colonial landscape style. These actually are 4 translights, light boxes, which sit in the corners of a very large installation. The installation draws its formal structure from the mandala being a formal device to focus attention, which is how I use it. So you are drawn inwards. It is centrifugal in its movement, and you walk right into the center of the installation. You are looking down, a bird's eye view, a bit like Pascal's isometric removed. And as you look down, what you see are a number of the senses. Each of the 5 senses is associated in Indian thought with the elements, sight, taste, the capacity of smelling, hearing, etc. And these are, you encounter them as fragmented body parts which are yet harmonized into a larger whole. So it's quite destabilizing. You have a sense of something that's broken up, fragmented, and disturbed, and yet it has some other kind of order. The whole installation plays with binaries, poison, nectar, harmony, disorder, and beauty and the grotesque. It works with the ancient myth of Neelkant. I don't know if you all know the story, but maybe I'll just retell it very quickly. So, for once, the gods and the demons decided to work together. They were otherwise always opposed. And they did so because they knew that neither alone could extract Amrit from the ocean. So they, of course, planned to cheat each other at the end, and they began. So it's a long, elaborate story, but Vasuki was the rope, and Mandara, the mountain, was the pivot, and they began to churn the cosmic ocean. And they were greedy for immortality. They wanted Amrit so that they could be immortal. As they churned, initially some wonderful things came up, the wish-fulfilling cow, the horn of plenty, etc., etc. But as they continued to churn, because no Amrit appeared, the ocean began to heave and spit and turn black, and it became this huge heaving mass of poison, the poison of time, called Calcutta. horrified by this, they cried out for help. The one god that was not part of this was Shiv. And moved by compassion for the fate of the world, he opened his mouth and he took the poison in. He couldn't take it into his own whole body, so he kept it in his throat, which is why he is then called Nilkant. For me, it was the perfect myth, the perfect allegory for what is happening. We, in our greed, are actually creating a poison which we have to somehow contain and find means to transform. We are all today Nilkants with this poison sitting at the base of our throat, the Vishuddhi chakra, which is from where speech and purification proceeds. So in the center is a video where you see, you don't see it like this because you're looking down on it, so it is not actually immediately recognizable as a throat. You see some kind of visceral human body struggling, a very, very tiny movement, and projected on that throat, it's a combination of painting and projection, are a series of images of garbage, including words as garbage. And the throat struggles to ingest. It sometimes succeeds, sometimes fails, and it's a kind of never-ending, ongoing struggle. I'll just take you back to the overview shot so that you get a sense of what it's like to look down. And it's actually something that makes you extremely uncomfortable, and it is both beautiful and grotesque. The whole work plays with the idea of the desire for nectar turning into poison, how nectar and poison are perhaps partake of each other in certain ways, and that this alchemical truth is something that we need to consider when we are looking at our situation today. Around this time, I got very interested in a kind of street toy that I found. I was working, I'm not showing that work, but I was doing a work on the great tragedian Meena Kumari, and I found these street toy televisions which used a very ingenious device to create the illusion of movement. They were still images that were heated up by a bulb, and they began to move simply by that, and it cast itself on a peculiar screen. This was very interesting, and then some years later I found that this object had been replaced by what's called the Chinese plasma action TV toy. This uses exactly the same principle, and these principles are actually the same as all the experiments before cinema, the 19th century pre-cinematic magic lanterns and all the experiments that led to the moving image finally, where basically you manually or mechanically move a still image to create the illusion of movement, which is of course what film ultimately does, but at an imperceptible speed. So I got very interested in this object and adapted and altered it, and I now have a whole genre of my practice which works with these. I'm sharing with you the first and then maybe a few later, called the Yamuna series, which also looks at Delhi and its environment. Here the ground that you see behind is a translucent image. It's a backlit light box. The taps actually move very slowly. They move across and return in a loop. It's a set of 3, it's a triptych. Here the grid of the city moves across the landfill. Here the woman, displaced from the banks of the Yamuna, holding her ID papers, moves across the garbage-choked banks of the Yamuna. I have a very small clip of another light box just to give you a sense of what this movement is like. So it's quite slow initially, you're not even sure that it's moving. And these are later experiments where I have 2 layers moving in opposite directions, and it gets more and more complex. It first started off with just one moving layer, which moves from left to right. How far has this gone from photography? In a sense, what I was doing in Wild Mothers was creating a palimpsest, layering translucent and transparent images to generate thicker meanings. And here in the light box, there's something similar happening, but with the additional a very important element of time, because when you look at one of these light boxes, the first thing that happens is that you slow down. And in that slowing down, there's a kind of particular quality of attention that is elicited that is very different from what comes up in relation to a still image or to an actual moving image. So this in-between space, and I like in-betweenness, as Mahesh said in the introduction, you can see that I'm playing around with lots of things that lie between things. This in-betweenness actually produces something quite special, and again offers the possibility of contemplative space. The reason I'll go to details. This is it's a very large work, so you can't really enjoy it here, but this should give you a better sense of the translucency and how it works. So this image is based on, as I go along, I'm increasingly now working with found images, doing digital manipulation, but they are always photographs that are part. So in a sense, it is not very dissimilar from what Pascal is doing, but I think I work very differently because time is very important. Time here is important not just in terms of the movement, but in fact this image collapses 3 times together: the past, the future, and the present. It's a Google map of Delhi with elements which are from Delhi's past, almost showing through eroded surface. Delhi was once desert and will return to being a desert with the way groundwater is dropping. There are a number of elements, and the figures that move across this landscape, and they move horizontally, it's about 8 feet long, so it's like a long scroll, are mutants. They are creatures who are there in the yoga pose, which is Shalabhasan, which is the locust pose, and locusts come at the time of destruction. They are a sign of impending apocalypse. So locust time, but they are survivors, they're mutants, their bones have come outside their flesh, they are scavengers, observers, moving across this landscape. Perhaps they are us. Just showing you some more moving image lightbox works. This uses images taken from NASA, satellite images of ecological disasters. This is Myanmar, Balakot earthquake, Sundarbans floods. And here the movement is of, it's called edible birds. I'm making a tension between the land, which is increasingly facing disastrous conditions and disasters, the body, which in yoga asanas, which drew its wisdom from observation of the natural world, but has become a form of privatized sealing off from the environment, and the only mediator between the natural world and the body is that of consumption. And so you have chickens, pheasants, all the birds that we eat. This work actually came after the work I'm going to show you now, which is all about birds. This concern with the environment and with landscape through history as a metaphor for understanding how human beings relate to nature and to the environment, and therefore a measure of who we are and where we are, is an important element in this work, which is called Winged Pilgrims, a chronicle from Asia. It's again a large installation using 12 light boxes. Each light box is about 46 inches wide by about 25 inches, just to give you a sense of the scale. And these landscapes, which I'll show you in detail, actually do 2 things. They track the movement of ideas, stories, and metaphors across Asia. This was a period when we were talking a lot about emerging Asia, about globalization, and it was also the period where there was this panic over Asian flu and avian flu, and thousands and thousands of birds were killed because of fear of the spread of the virus. The first bird to be killed in Europe, and the panic was really in Europe because this was coming from Asia, and it was somehow tied into a lot of other panics to do with what comes from this part of the world into that part of the world, was a wild swan. And for me, that was a metaphoric, very powerful metaphor for where we were as human beings today, because the swan, as you know, is the symbol of the wisdom of discrimination. So as you enter the space, you would hear a sound, which I'm not playing for you, and you would encounter these 5 seated monks. The monks hold in their hands, where they would classically have held sacred texts, they form one end of a long history of exchange across and within Asia. What this installation does is try and look at what constitutes Asia, not in terms of globalization, which is always seen as the West happening to us, but actually Asian cosmopolitanism, and how we've had our own forms of global exchange within Asia, which have produced who we are. The monks hold these toy TVs, which these are purchased from the street markets, and the images have been replaced by images of the men in contamination suits collecting the dead birds. And as you move across the space, you encounter a quasi-historical movement across Asia and Asian forms of landscape, and the crossing over. These are fantasy landscapes. What I found was being sold as kind of kitsch entertainment objects in the street markets were these quite amazing fantasy landscapes, which would have Golden Gate Bridge, Dubai Towers, tigers basking in the sun, dolphins and fighter jets, all collaged into some sort of utopic fantasy. So these are a different set of fantasy landscapes. You have Chinese brush and ink with a text which is the first text that went in the 6th century from India to Japan. It's the Pragyaparamita Buddhist text, and flying across it is the Garud, itself a hybrid creature, and they say that the shape of the pagoda came from the wings of the Garuda. So I'm not going to describe each image, I think they're quite self-explanatory, and just go through these landscapes. So we're drawing on all the landscape traditions, including documentary photography. And I'm using a lot of elements found from fables and stories across the region. So it was quite extraordinary to find a story about a parrot in India, to find an almost identical story in Persia, and then the same story with a different name in Japan. So these resonances were really very interesting to find. I draw also on multiple schools of painting. So this draws on Basoli, Tibetan Tanka, Company School, and classical wooden sculpture. This is called the Conference of the Birds, and actually brings together many painterly traditions around the stories of the famous text. Moving across it are battery hens in an assembly line. These give you a better idea of what it's actually like to encounter the light boxes, because the moving layer melds into the still layer. I'm concluding with, I've obviously not included all the different experiments, just a few of them for this discussion today. And I'm ending with something that is really a gesture towards the digital moment. Here the photographer has disappeared, and there's only the interaction with the camera. The subject is both. It's an interactive installation that was installed in various places, a shopping mall and museums, where when you enter, it's a two-way screen. You enter a booth, not so different from entering the old-fashioned photography booth in the bazaar tradition, and as soon as you enter, you see yourself on the screen. And then things begin to happen to you. Your body is transformed. It is filled, it is silhouetted, it is changed. You go through a cycle of foods. The work is called Bhogi Rogi, consumption disease, and it's about GM foods, and it's about trying to reduce that distance between something that seems to be an issue out there to actually embody it and experience it in your own body. So as you go through the cycle of transformations that being in that space enables, and you can play with it, it's quite performative and it's profoundly narcissistic. And I wanted to use the narcissism that is so much part of the way we use the image today, and particularly with mobile phones, social media, etc., to use it for us to open up the space for some kind of criticality. So you can see that it goes through all the foods. I don't think I have all of them, but and it slowly starts to get a bit less fun, because you start encountering, this was around the time of the BT Brinjal debate, and you start then seeing these bangans, which become almost as though they're metastasizing. They take on a very uncomfortable air, and then you get the production of the modified food, which rapidly turns into DNA and the barcode which comes across your face. So basically implying that we are next in line for commercial genetic manipulation. And it leads you to an image of cloned babies, which is also an image of death. But since this is all narcissistic fun, the death dissolves and you're back in the mustard field. The interesting thing about showing this was that as soon as people realized that they were seen outside on the other side of the two-way screen, they would get somebody to come and photograph them. And once they were photographed, it was like the experience was completed. Very often they would leave the cycle of transformations once the photograph was taken. So in a way, my attempt to use the narcissism and the kind of strategies of consumption to introduce criticality got reconsumed in particular ways. But it's very interesting, and it continues to be something that I think has considerable potential for opening up conversations. I'd just like to go back to something that I've mentioned several times, about the relationship with the viewer. In a way, this is it is both the most interactive and the most viewer determined, and also the most predetermined, because what happens to the viewer is something that I have designed, of course, with technical help from Thomas Icon. It's collaboration with him. He's a games designer and it works with gaming technology. And yet there is this illusion of freedom, playfulness, and enjoying looking at yourself. Tropes which I think are quite crucial to image production and image consumption today. It embodies, I think, what I mean when I say the photograph is no longer record nor object, but is perhaps today an event. So I leave you with the most recent lightbox. It's an image of myself looking out at the city of Delhi with its disappearing natural space, with the hyper-urbanization, and with a series of black water tanks which seem to become the leitmotif of urban landscape. Moving, it has 4 layers. Moving between me and the landscape is a text is 70 words in Sanskrit. Each of these 70 words mean water. They do not mean rainwater, well water, river water. They mean simply water. I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sheba. I did have the opportunity to see the last body of work. I mean, not this one, but the projection at Art Chennai last year. And I do remember we were all running in and out and getting each other photographed and what we were looking under that. What I'd like to touch upon is what you earlier spoke about, the work from Kashmir. Everybody's fortunate, that they may get into a museum or a gallery, which takes, as you know better, it takes many, many number of years before you can be out there. Do you have any thoughts on it, that how does one start working on issues which are obviously affecting all of us, and at the same time, the struggle of trying to put it out there, because editors are not interested, as you know, galleries are not interested because they can't sell it. But is there anything you can reflect on this?
It's a struggle. In a way, I would say, if I look back at the early years, there were no institutions, there were no spaces, so we invented spaces. They were very often tied to the particular issues we were working in. So my first photographs were shown in community centers or even in bastis, in baratkars, which was a very ad hoc, informal way. So it's a long journey from that to being invited to intervene in a mall or being part of a museum. I would say that there are more institutional spaces available today than there were earlier, number one. Number two, the galleries, which, I got involved with galleries after about 15 or 18 years of practicing. Galleries are very recent in my life. They were not interested. It was not saleable work. This is work which is actually got social concerns, and it's not easy to place Neelkant in your drawing room. It's not so, so galleries were not interested. So I worked with a lot of the cultural centers, whether it was Visual Arts Center, Max Muller Bhavan. All these spaces at that time were spaces that one could somehow work with, as well as trying to create other spaces. Today I actually see more possibilities than there were at that time, and I think it's the urgency of what you want to bring into public domain, and also its context. So I didn't show that work, but the Delhi Public Library, where I did a very large installation in 2008, is a fantastic public space. It's not something we consider, but actually there's a huge amount of space there. There are a number of spaces that exist and that need to be vitalized and can be accessed. We don't have the kind of state infrastructure that, say, community arts has in Europe. So we have to create it, we have to find our way.
Question from Amit.
Hello. Your Kashmir project, it really seemed interactive and a layman would understand it, and one doesn't have to be a photographer or artist to understand that. But later on, when you put metaphors and symbolism and layers into your work, do you think it becomes difficult for the layman to understand that and take your message away, which you want to portray?
I think I'm interested in complex communication. I'm not interested only in communicating. I'm interested in a complex conversation, in thickening the content, in thickening the understanding. When you see these works as projected on the screen, you're actually getting not even 50%. These are highly experiential works. They're immersive spaces. So in that immersive space, a number of things are happening to you sensorially, which is not only in terms of content, issue, information. And I believe that to be very valuable, to draw in all the layers of the psyche and mind into engaging with something. It's not just about getting the info. So the complexity is very valuable for me, and I'm willing to go as far as I can to encourage that complex conversation. It would be, I started off very involved with producing activist propaganda and doing that kind of work, which I moved away from because it didn't have enough complexity. So I do art because it gives you the possibility of complex conversations. I'm not sure I understand.
What I'm trying to say is the elders, when you were trying to...
The elders?
The elderly women?
Yeah, the women ascetics, yeah.
So did they actually feel sexual, and did they understand the concept while they were willing to be portrayed?
Is it about Silver Sap, the aging body?
Yes.
Oh yes, this is a woman who I don't work with. After I moved away from documentary practice, I work with people who are actually friends. I long before the camera comes in, we have conversations. It's a long relationship. Even with the women sadhus, I spent a long time without the camera. So these are relationships where one talks about things together and then moves towards making the photograph together. For me, that's quite critical, that this empathetic relationship is created, that she is actually as interested in what I'm exploring. So I've shifted out of that other kind of relationship of shooting people a long time ago.
One more question there. Chandan?
A couple of months ago, I read the Republic and I read Theaetetus by Plato, and in both the works he talks about three virtues: goodness, truth, and beauty. And my question is around the latter two. Increasingly, ever since I read that dialogue, both the dialogues, and I've been thinking about it, especially in context of a work of art, truth and beauty many a times come into conflict. Even when I was looking at your work, be it the aesthetics of the labored woman or the Kashmir, the body of work dealing with the situation in Kashmir, or the women holding the ID cards in front of the Yamuna and the landfill specifically, do you, in your practice while making these works, or as someone who's engaging with these thoughts, do you encounter a similar conflict between these two qualities and virtues? And if you do, how does one reconcile? Because I've been making photographs since the last 1.5 years actively. And since the last 1 year, ever since this, I've been sort of reflecting over these, what he wrote. There is this tension, which is enjoyable, but still, from you, I'm sharing it for the first time. So I want to know how does one reconcile? How do you reconcile, if you do?
First of all, there is no such thing as truth. There are only multiple truths. There is no one singular absolute truth. So when you have a sense of there being many truths, the entire tension changes. There is still a tension. But if you, I think this is partly what I meant when I said I moved away from the apparent objective truth-like nature of the documentary photograph, which seeks to present itself as though it is the truth. This is the truth, while it's only one version of the truth. And this, I think, we are completely aware of. So if we say that there is no absolute, singular, one truth, and there are multiple truths, then the entire question of what you are seeking within a particular image you create or an artwork that you encounter changes. You're not looking for some universal in everything, but you're looking for either its own truth or your truth that you experience in relation to that work. And this is also mutable and likely to change. Similarly, beauty is, I would prefer to use aesthetics, because aesthetics is not about beauty, it's about formal languages. Formal languages can work with very grotesque or unpleasant material, but in formal terms that would actually satisfy aesthetics. So I think it's also important to examine what one means by the idea of beauty. The Platonian ideas were also arose out of a particular historical context, and we need to really re-examine these given as absolute values in today's world. I don't know if that's any help at all.
Just one more question, if anyone wants to ask. There. No, you don't have to. You don't have to force yourself.
I'm here because of Dinesh.
Most welcome to.
I've known Dinesh for a very long time. So how are you doing?
Good.
I'm here. I just wanted to correlate a couple of your answers. One is, of course, the fact that pictures have multiple layers of meaning, and the fact that there is no specific truth, and it's all a matter of perspective, or perhaps. So, have you, or do you fear, as we go along, and it's happened now in India, that there's enormous space for misinterpretation of the kind that's banned a guy like Hussein, and would like to comment a bit on that. I'd like to hear about what you feel about this as we go along, considering that everyone citizens of journalism.
Misinterpretation is not how I would name that. I think it's when multiple meanings get narrowed down, when you are in fact not allowed to have many, many versions of what one thing that a single truth, that you actually end up with fundamentalism and with fascism. So I don't call that misinterpretation, I call it an attempt to homogenize thought, to actually reduce Hussein to a particular kind of Muslim character. I call it an attempt to reduce Hinduism, which celebrates the naked goddess, into something that has a new kind of moral police who think they know the truth, and they are attempting to impose this truth on everybody else. And the danger there is the belief in that being the truth.
I understand what you're trying to say, in the sense that you would believe that this misinterpretation, as I use the word, is actually a motivated thing. I mean, it's obviously the people who have seen that image perhaps understand the complexity, but would rather tie it down to controversy. If you believe that this actually is not, by accident, but by design, we have a major danger. I mean, you have reasonably well-qualified people who can interpret images, but decide to interpret it in a particular way to give it a meaning that they wish to give it to. If that is the real problem, then of course there is perhaps a solution. But there could be misinterpretation because people are not actually educated in what's called the visual language, particularly with kind of our 165 channels of television, camera being thrust in face, kind of images. I thought you might make a difference between the two.
I'm sorry, I might have to intervene here. Would you like to give a short response to that? Because I think we've run over time.
Well, I think it's a complex area, and I won't go into any long reply, but I would say that if we are worried about what's happening, one thing that we can do is keep multiple meanings alive.
Right. Thank you, Sheba.
The image. The movements have always been impelled by questions. They are not formal experiments for the sake of form alone. So I start with where I began my photographic practice, which was as a documentary photographer, very active in the women's movement in Delhi. This is 1980. And I spent about 10 to 15 years building up a photographic archive of the women's movement. This image takes on a particular resonance today after December 13, where we have witnessed yet again, 20 years on, the general outspilling of public outrage on violence against women. This is Satyarani, whose daughter was murdered for dowry and who spent 30 long years fighting for justice to try and bring the culprits to book. I'm not showing you, this is a very large body of image, it's about 10 to 15 years of work, but by the end, it begins in the 80s, it goes up to the early 90s, and sometime around the end of the 80s and the 90s, I began to question my own practice. What I was doing at that time was to try and offer an alternative to the mainstream images of women, either as bejeweled, beautiful creatures or helpless, poor, suffering victims. These were images of strength, of protest, of women struggling to change their conditions, resisting the oppression that they faced. However, in 10 years of developing these images, both as a history for ourselves, I was not a photographic relationship between the subject and the photographer, between the viewer and the image. I then went into an experiment with 7 women, fellow travelers in the women's movement, fellow feminists, and invited them to collaborate with me to create a set of what I called staged or constructed portraits. Each woman was invited to choose a site, objects, a gaze, a posture that she felt would tell her story. So I moved from working with the photograph as document to, in a sense, the photograph as fiction, as subjective narration. So this is Satyarani in 91, 10 years later from the image you last saw, firmly sitting on the steps of the Supreme Court. The files that are arranged on the steps are 70 cases of dowry victims that she was also helping, because in the process of fighting for her own daughter, she became a kind of barefoot lawyer, a part of an organization that assisted women in distress. Woven through the files is her daughter's wedding sari and the graduation photo. So these portraits, which I call feminist portraits, the series is called 7 Lives and a Dream, represented a major shift away in terms of photographic practice. These were collaborative images made together with the women. A dialogue, an intersubjective space produced by what happened between us. So the image was neither created by me nor by the woman, but by what came up between us. We would often take photographs, look at small prints, contact sheets were difficult mostly, redo, rework. It was a sort of theater of the self, and the invitation was to perform your own story. This has strong resonances, of course, with the Bazaar Studio vernacular tradition, which we're all quite familiar with, and I think there's been some discussion in the festival already around that. So this practice is somewhere between the documentary and the Bazaar Studio, and I think perhaps in the early 90s was the first example of using the staged or constructed portrait to narrativize and to shift away from this false idea of the photograph being a representation of the real, but in fact making the fictional explicit. So here you see Shah Jahan Appa. The setup that we created, these were like mise en scènes, almost like theatrical frames within which each woman would perform her story. It's very interesting how almost everybody included a previous photograph in their mise en scène. So you have here documentary photographs taken over the years, which are part of her setup, the burqa, a little house made out of a shoebox, because she said, "Meri kahani jhuggi jhompdi ki kahani hai." Urvashi Butalia, who some of you may be familiar with. Her fantasy was to set up her large collection of typewriters on the street, but we just weren't able to achieve it. So this is within her own home, with several other elements brought in together to photojournalists. So these images were not to be published in newspapers or for that kind of public dissemination, but they were really for ourselves, and their circulation was primarily within the women's movement and other similar social movements. At the end of this period, I remember one day where I went to a demonstration a little early, as usual, and found a large group of press photographers who were directing the women to take on the classic pose of the raised hand and the shouting mouth. It was a very interesting moment, because the image, which was an alternative, subversive, radical image, which I had generated in my own practice over 10 years, had become, again, a stereotype. It sought to counter conventional stereotypes, but it ended up becoming a new kind of stereotype. So was this now an image which actually reflected the women that I knew, because I was a participant in the movement. I wasn't photographing from the outside. I would be pointing the camera one moment and shouting slogans the next. These thoughts, concerns also about the sort of false objectivity of the documentary image, which was the kind of lie told by the mainstream media, which presents you images as though they are the truth, while we very well know that they are not. They are subjective, constructed, created, manipulated, even though they seem to represent reality. Also questions about the relationships of power inherent in the photo.
So we continue the journey in the in-between world this afternoon. Sheba Chhachhi is works, as she says, in the in-between world of photographs and other visual art forms, where she uses photographs to, in installations, painting, etc., and which she'll explain now. She's based in Delhi. and she had studied at Delhi University and at NID. I hand over to Sheba.
Thank you, Mahesh, and thank you, Dinesh and Prashant and the whole team of Delhi Photo Festival to invite me to speak here today. It's wonderful to be part of the festival this year. I wasn't here last year. And it's good to be part of a community that I am a kind of illegitimate member of. Photographers tend to think of me as an artist. Artists think of me as the photographer who snuck into the art world. I do, in fact, have a hybrid, in-between kind of practice, something that works with the photographic image, which lies at the heart of my work, but moves from the most standard, conventional use of the photographic image, that of the document, the record, the evidential or the indexical, to multiple other ways of extending the vocabulary of the photographic image. What I'm going to do today is share with you some of these experiments and attempts to move the image itself and to move my own understanding of